So next up on the custom Navi front, we've got the MSI RX 5700 XT, presented with this crazy champagne gold, all aluminium exterior. So a pretty unique design, but let's dive into the specs and see what it's offering. Now when you're looking at the frequencies in the table, it's important to remember that there are hundreds of actual states along the voltage frequency curve, so they're kind of guideline figures. Still, MSI's figures suggest that it's using a higher overclock than we saw with the Sapphire Pulse, despite a similar board power. It's still unclear how much variance there can be between cards, but on paper this looks like it's going to be the fastest so far. Note that there's still no memory overclock, but this is going to be common across the partners. Whereas on the Sapphire Pulse card you get a dual BIOS switch with proper sort of performance and silent BIOSes, there's no such luck on the MSI card, and I think this is a shame. Now, partway through our testing, MSI did deliver a so-called silent BIOS to us, but we had to flash it to the card ourselves. And if you're a consumer, this is a pretty crappy way to go about it, to be honest. Now, MSI has said that if you do this, it will be covered under warranty. And we're also reading that there's a chance that the silent BIOS will be the one that retail cards ship with. But regardless, either way, I think it's just a shame that it didn't come with a proper dual BIOS functionality. Looking at the card itself, we find that the build quality is really rather good. And this is a result of MSI using aluminium for both the front and the back, which is not something that you often see. Now, the aluminium on the back is somewhat wasted because MSI has not connected it to the PCB with thermal pads, so it's not really going to help out as much as it could with cooling, but it's still good to see a fully aluminium shroud. Note that these little cutout sections are made of plastic, but the colour matches rather nicely. Physically, they've gone for an approach in terms of size that's pretty similar to what we saw with Sapphire. Namely, it's shorter than the reference, but it is substantially taller, and it also impedes on 3 slots, so it's a 2.5 slot design. Now what this does is allows MSI, again, like Sapphire, to use rather large fans atop the cooler, and these are MSI's Torx 3.0 models. Now these are semi-passive, and the cutoff point is around 60 degrees Celsius, so below that they're going to turn off completely, which we always like to see. However, do note that an ongoing API issue with AMD means that they will report as spinning even when they're not. Elsewhere, things are largely the same as we've seen before. You get 3 display ports and 1 HDMI on the outputs, and you get a 6-pin and 8-pin connector for power, giving the card technically 300 watts of available power. Note also that the power plugs are indented, so if you've got like long PCI power cables, that's going to help you out. And one final thing to touch on is that the warranty with this card comes in at 3 years, which compares favourably to Sapphire, which is 2 years, and some partners on the reference design also only offer a 2-year warranty. Before we get to the teardown proper, I just want to make a quick note about the fans, because the Sapphire ones had a really nice quick disconnect system that involved just a single screw which you could remove through the fan blades. For the MSI ones, it's slightly different. You have to disconnect at least 3 screws, and you have to pull off the whole shroud and disconnect the cables in order to get these off, so not quite as convenient. Other than that, it's fairly easy to disassemble the card. There are 4 main screws for the cooler and 2 smaller ones here, so we'll take those off, and there's also some adhesive holding the card together, but it isn't that hard to navigate. So starting with the cooler, we can see that it's being cooled with thermal paste rather than a graphite pad. This is connecting it to a copper contact plate and 4 copper heat pipes, and all the copper has been given a nickel plating for a nice consistent shine. The copper heat pipes then feed an aluminium fin stack, and the fins are arranged in such a way as to allow air to escape out of the rear I/O directly, but also the open shroud means that airflow is still going to be exhausted into your case, so you do need to make sure that your exhaust airflow is pretty good. MSI is also relying on the same heatsink to directly cool the memory and the VRMs. Now, the positive news is that, cooling the memory and VRMs directly is always what we prefer to see, but where they get a bit different to Sapphire is that the contact plate with the pads is directly connected to the main heatsink rather than being its own separate one. What this means is that heat from the GPU is possibly going to affect the cooling of the memory by sort of heating up everything together. Now, again, it's still good that they're getting direct cooling, but we do also have concerns about the size of some of the memory pads, such as these 2 here on the PCB, which don't really offer full coverage. We're not really sure why that is. It wouldn't have been that difficult to have extended the contact plate. Likewise, the little thermal pad cooling down the MOSFETs is directly connected to the main heatsink, and this is taking care only of the main GPU power phases. The other ones are not catered for. The main test is going to be in the thermal performance, but it's always interesting to note the different approaches taken by the different companies, and we'll see how that plays out in the results later. Taking a quick look at the PCB, it's actually strikingly similar to the design that we saw from Sapphire. So you've got your GPU here, you've got your GDDR6 memory chips around here, the 7 main power phases are here, plus an extra one for the GPU there. You've got 2 memory power phases up here, and there's an extra one controlling the memory bus here. The board design actually looks quite similar to the reference design as well, at least once you take out the space that AMD left for its single fan. Now, we're not sure if the board partners are working with some sort of shorter reference design, but really we can't see many key differences between this one and Sapphire. Anyway, let's get on to the benchmarks. Since we can't control the temperature in our labs, this graph should act as a guideline only, but it's still useful for looking at general card behaviour. MSI's card is the first we've seen to boost consistently beyond 1900 MHz, and it's typically around 80 MHz higher than reference, which reflects the figures given to us by MSI. The consistency is a little worse than others, suggesting it's bumping into its power limit more often, but there's no sign of clock speed decay as a result of poor thermals. We didn't actually bother plotting the silent mode BIOS because it made so little difference to clocks that it wasn't worth it. You can see this reflected in the 3D Mark score where the results are within margin of error. We're not showing all our games because we'll just end up repeating ourselves, but the full set of 1080p and 1440p results are available over on the website. The card has no problems at 1080p, so we're handpicking the most relevant 1440p results, starting with Metro Exodus, where performance is basically on par with RTX 2070 Super. This game also shows you the sort of difference you can expect to see over the other 5700 XTs, in other words, not very much. Overall, there's less than 0.5% between this and the Sapphire Pulse, and even the reference card is only beat by 4% across the tests. As with Metro Exodus, Shadow of the Tomb Raider sees MSI's card nipping at the heels of RTX 2070 Super, this time with a constant frame rate over 60 FPS. It's also a good illustration of the average difference between this card and the reference RX 5700, which is 15% overall across our benchmarks. Another game that's always over 60 FPS is The Division 2, although here the difference shifts more towards Nvidia's favour. Even so, the MSI card is 9% faster than RTX 2060 Super here, which is a close reflection of the 11% gap we saw overall. Note, however, that this gap will close when looking at decent third-party variants of the Nvidia card, like the Gigabyte Gaming OC, with the Evoke OC only managing a 6% lead overall compared to that card. Total War 3 Kingdoms is where the card has its lowest average frame rate, but 53 FPS is still good. This is a game where Nvidia does best, and across all our games the RTX 2070 maintains a 5% lead on average. Again, this will be higher when considering overclocked versions. Total system power consumption is higher with this card than on any other 5700 XT, but that's to be expected. Although it's not shown, this figure is approaching what we see from RTX 2080 Ti Founders Edition. Flashing to the silent BIOS sees a slight reduction in power consumption. Presented like this, the temperature graph certainly looks good. A difference over ambient of 42 degrees is clearly excellent, as it's 16 degrees below reference and 6 degrees below Sapphire. However, it appears MSI has tuned its fan curve precisely to look good in graphs like this, as it's louder than we'd like. We observed fan speeds around 2300 RPM, and this was pretty noisy. Not as loud as reference, but definitely louder than Sapphire, and we reckon that pulse card strikes a much better balance out of the box. The silent mode simply caps things around 2000 RPM, which isn't much quieter, making it largely pointless. Memory temperatures were lower than on the other cards, and VRM temperatures were roughly equal across the board, but both these metrics worsen with the silent BIOS, again suggesting Sapphire's cooler is better balanced. Overclocking figures should always be taken with a pinch of salt and are not representative. Still, we pushed this card faster than the Sapphire one, literally by maxing out all of the sliders. Power was set to 120%, the core clock to 2150 MHz, which is the absolute peak of the curve, not the average boost clock, and the memory to 950 MHz, which is 15.2 gigabits per second. This saw clock speeds hit around 2075 MHz, giving us a bit more performance than we got from Sapphire. Power consumption again goes up massively, however. The cooler copes with this in that the GPU, memory and VRM do get hotter, but not to dangerous levels. Interestingly, at this level of power, Sapphire's card is more aggressively tuned in terms of fan speeds, and is actually the louder card when you're overclocking. Our best advice, regardless of which card, is to impose a fan speed limit that works for your surroundings and focus mainly on increasing the power limit. So, bringing things to a close, we've done the performance testing and we can see that it's pretty much on par with Sapphire. You do get a higher boost clock with this, but this only translated to a 0.5% lead across the games, and honestly that's a difference that could be made up depending on the quality of silicon that you get from either card, which means it's going to come down mainly to cooler quality and pricing. Now in the US, pricing doesn't appear to be final, but it's looking like it's going to be $430, which is $20 more than Sapphire, and in the UK, this is going to be £440, which is the same price as the Sapphire card. Now regardless of which market you look at, we're not really convinced that the price makes this card worth it when it's competing against the Sapphire card. MSI appears to have chased positioning in graphs more than anything else by putting in an aggressive overclock and an aggressive fan curve, but Sapphire's card comes out as the better balanced one, especially when you consider the inclusion of a proper dual BIOS switch. Now MSI's card does have some things going for it. The aesthetics are unique, the build quality is very good, and it's certainly better than the reference design, but overall the balance of the cooler design just isn't really there, and it's not where we'd like it to be. So that brings this review to a close, but do stay tuned on the channel as we have the Power Color Red Devil card tested, and that review will be coming soon. We also have some 5700 designs coming in from Sapphire and Asus, and there'll probably be more custom Navi designs further down the line. So hit subscribe to stay up to date with those, leave us your feedback in the comments below, and other than that, I will see you next time.